All right. Anyway, well, thanks again for the opportunity to share one of our cooler projects that I've had the chance to work on in the last 25 years here with the city. And anyway, a few weeks ago, we talked about at a lot higher level than that. And this today we're going to dive in a little bit more on the regulatory partnerships here and a little bit more behind why those partnerships were in place in the for this particular project. Again, just kind of as a quick review, the city is in the midst of a really developing finally developing the riverfront here in Grand Junction. Usually we have left it to be kind of a wasteland in the past, and but our two major efforts right now are the riverfront at Las Colonias, which we're just finishing up. Bonsai Designs is just starting construction there on the north side of Butterfly Lake. And then and Rocky Mounts is already under construction, and everyone's been enjoying the river park earlier this year. And then right now we're under construction right now down here by the riverfront at Dos Rios, which is just west of the Highway 50 or 5th Street Bridge there just south of the Riverside neighborhood. So just kind of quick review over the Las Colonias Park itself. Phase 1 was completed in 2018, shown here in red, and orange was completed here earlier this year, and then the river park itself was completed earlier this year as well. And includes the river park here, includes the dog park, some plaza, some retail restaurant space, a festival area, Butterfly Lake, a zip line, hopefully here in the next 12 to 18 months, as well as a number of business pads that we hope to attract manufacturers of outdoor equipment. And so far, our first two tenants are exactly that. So we're excited about everything there. But the real purpose of today's topic here is talking about some of the regulatory partnerships that we had coming along with this particular project. We had Department of Energy, Colorado Department of Health and Environment, as well as the Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and Colorado Parks and Wildlife involved. Just a quick look back. Some of these slides will be duplicative of what we saw last week, but just kind of again as a reminder of what has happened down here on the site and what sins were committed in the past and what we need to overcome there. But this was the sugar beet factory back in 1906 that was present down there on Las Colonias. This is what it looked like in the 1950s as we were processing uranium for not only power production, but also for the Cold War weapons and so forth. And so this is kind of a view looking down to the southeast where Orchard Mesa Middle School is now back here in this.
He was excited. Sorry, I'm trying to think and do stuff at the same time. He is excited because we're gonna have the same scars.
Hey Sarah, I think your mic might. So anyway, so this was the uranium processing site back in, again, in the 1950s. We produced over 4.6 million tons of tailings that were produced by the mills. And then we gave it out because it was such great material. We gave it out to everyone in our community to use as good material underneath their foundations, around water pipes, sewer pipes, sidewalks, or underneath sidewalks and so forth. And so another 1 million tons were given out for that type of use. You can even see how big energy was here for our valley. This was our Welcome to Grand Junction sign back in the 1950s. You can see the atom here in our insignia there. But anyway, this is what it looked like during the cleanup in 1991 as those 4.5 million tons of mill tailings were hauled off to a repository south of town. This is a view looking down the river. This is where the new amphitheater is. This is Eagle Rim Park, Orchard Mesa Middle School, and then the Riverside Parkway comes along, something like this. But all the mill tailings were picked up and hauled out on a train and down to Whitewater, and then in Whitewater they then put them in trucks and then hauled them out the rest of the way. They ended up, so here's Grand Junction, the processing site shown in red on this little inset graphic. And the disposal site was about 18 miles from Las Colonias site and about 2.5 miles south of Canna Creek. They're off of Highway 50, and this is a picture of that repository here. So after that was all cleaned up, there was a conveyance from the Department of Energy to the city that went through the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And so what's the catch? They just ended up giving us, well over 100 acres worth of land. So what was the catch? Well, the catch was that the Federal Uranium Mill Tailings Radiation Control Act of 1978 said, hey, once you're done cleaning this up, federal government, once you're done cleaning this up, it's okay to transfer these sites to a public entity. But the deal is you have to maintain, that public entity must maintain ownership of that perpetually, forever. And so in order for us to then develop it with any other interests in mind, such as trying to attract those manufacturers of outdoor products, we have to lease that property. And so our city charter limited us to only doing that for about 25 years. And then last November, voters gave us the authorization to extend that to 99-year leases, which meant that from a lending standpoint, from banker standpoint, they would be able to count that as the same as if the development owned the property outright. So here are some of the other covenants, or institutional controls is what they were called. And down here on the mill tailing site, because uranium was there and we had some groundwater that had some uranium that is still contaminated somewhat with uranium and radiation and so forth, is that we cannot use any of the groundwater. And we already have an ordinance against that. But the groundwater with or without the mill tailing site is, with or without this mill tailing site, it's already naturally high in salt content. And so that really wasn't a big deal for us. Anyone who tried to harvest the water and try to drink it or anything like that would find it incredibly salty very quickly and choose a different beverage. So anything that happens down there on the site, we have to have Department of Energy and Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment approval. Both agencies have been great to work with. They've been very prompt on their reviews, but anything from the river park to our development of the festival area, the restroom shelters down there, the buildings such as what Bonsai and Rocky Mounts are building, all of those had to go through Department of Energy's and CDPHE's review. So that was some of the other covenants that we had to sign up for or agree to when we took over the land. We also have lined our waterways and lake. We live in a desert, so we didn't want to lose any of our water anyway, and we wanted to avoid that groundwater commingling with our cleaner surface water, which is coming down off the mesa. Some of the other parameters were that we had to have 18 inches of clean fill under areas that were going to be actively used, such as the dog park, the festival area, the amphitheater. And then, but again, that really wasn't that big or onerous of a requirement, as we needed probably 6 to 8 inches worth of topsoil to get anything to grow down there anyway. We needed 24 inches of clean fill underneath any building. And again, with the shales that were present there on site, any of the structural engineers in designing foundations, they want 24 inches of structural fill anyway as a minimum. So didn't again see that really as a big deal. And then building barriers. So if you're building a building over the top of that's going to be habitable, like for people working and so forth, you need to build those buildings so that any radiation that might be working its way through the building or whatever could be easily harvested and then kicked out to the open air and so forth. And so we do radon mitigation very commonly here in the valley and really across the many places in the country, radon mitigation is fairly common. And so that just involves a series of pipes underneath the buildings and a layer of gravel that, as those gases and radiation might come up out of the soils, they would hit those systems and then be actively vented out and away from any of the habitable space. So those were some of the other constraints or covenants that we had to work with. Moving over to some of the other regulatory partnerships that we had. We had the Army Corps of Engineers, and we'll get into exactly what their role was here, and then U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and then Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And Army Corps permitting oversees the permitting for all of this. And again, I'll get into more detail here in just a minute. But the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, being another federal agency, the Army Corps then had to consult with U.S. Fish and Wildlife to see if they had any concerns with our project. But anyway, again, we, as I mentioned before, we met with them early and often, and we had a willingness to modify our design to meet those goals and objectives. And for our particular project, we needed to work with the Army Corps there when we were working on our boat ramp, as well as our storm drain outfalls, as well as the slough, or now it's known as the river park improvements. So those regulatory partnerships. So where does U.S. Army Corps have the jurisdiction over all of this? Well, it comes from the Clean Water Act from the early 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, and particularly Section 404, and which established a program to regulate discharge of any dredged material coming out of the rivers or any fill material going into the waters of the U.S., including wetlands and so forth. We as a country prior to the 1970s, we were doing anything and pretty much anything we wanted adjacent to our riverways and or in our riverways. And we decided as a country that probably wasn't the best idea of such a great resource. And so that was part of why the Clean Water Act was put together. Army Corps of Engineers then takes jurisdiction over that and permits any fills or dredge work that might happen in mining activity, highways, airport projects, and so forth. And those activities require a permit from the Army Corps before those activities can take place. And so they normally take jurisdiction below the normal high water mark, which is roughly, hopefully you guys have heard of what a 100-year event is. And that is when a flood event that has the statistical probability of happening once every 100 years. Well, the jurisdiction for the Army Corps is for an event that happens, say, once every 2 years. And so not real high up into that 100-year floodplain at all. But they take jurisdiction there, and they have a series of permits that they issue. And these are nationwide permits and regional permits. And these permits are what they call pre-vetted authorizations, or one that went through a very public process. And if a project fits those requirements, then they're authorized. The alternative is an individual permit, if you're not within the parameters of a particular permit. And we'll get into that a little bit later, and it sounds to me like you guys, your next week's class will definitely get into more of what the Army Corps is looking, what they look for in their permitting as well. But they basically are.
I just wanted to, before you got too far down into the Army Corps, I did see a question pop up on the chat that goes back to the fill requirements that relate to the hazardous, to the old mill tailings issues. If you just the purpose of the fill soil, all those requirements about how much soil, clean soil had to be under buildings and so on, and the purpose for that.
So the purpose of that is, so in the buildings, we had those building barriers, the radon mitigation system, the plastic and kind of as a vapor barrier, and then the venting systems underneath the buildings. And so what they were looking for outside was the clean fill to, again, provide a natural barrier, if you will, in between anything coming through those soils, any radon and any radiation that's still residual radiation that might be coming up through there. That 24 inches of clean fill under the buildings and the 18 inches of clean fill underneath those actively managed areas or actively used areas. That's the purpose of that fill. And that's a great question. Yeah.
Thanks.
Moving back, you bet. Moving back into the Army Corps elements there, we talked about the 3 different permits, the nationwide, regional, and individual permits. But what they are looking for are, they're considering various interests on behalf of all of us as citizens of the United States. And that Clean Water Act and the Environmental or the Endangered Species Act has put a lot of this onto the Army Corps to consider, okay, what are those impacts to wetlands that are so important to waterfowl and to aquatic species? Historic properties, fish and wildlife values, flood hazards, floodplains, recreation, water supply, water quality, mineral needs, and so forth. And so those are all the various interests that they have there. So they operate with about 54 nationwide permits, and these are permits that are fairly minimal individual that have minimal individual and cumulative environmental impacts. And so, like say you put in a boat ramp, well, that isn't going to be too onerous. Now, if it was 300 feet long and disturbed, 7 or 8 acres, then we'd probably be looking at an individual permit. But something like what we use down at or we constructed down there at Las Colonias, we were able to fit that underneath one of these nationwide permits. And so they've got 54 of those. I've highlighted a few of them here just to kind of give you an idea of what we use as a municipality. And we use them for outfall structures or storm drain outfall structures. Anytime we're building utilities over or under the river, we would be underneath that nationwide permit number 12. Bank stabilization, linear transportation projects such as roads and trails. And then for our projects down here, we used the aquatic habitat restoration, enhancement, and establishment, actually for the river park. We used that for the slough enhancements. And then rather than using boat ramps for our boat ramp, we actually used recreational facilities because we were able to fit underneath that nationwide. We had a larger footprint than what was allowed underneath nationwide 36. So we went to a nationwide 42. But all of those permits have limits on what's defined as minimal. And then, and most of them require us to notify the Army Corps in advance. And so prior to construction or pre-construction, notify them for their review. And then you have the Endangered Species Act of 1973 that kicks in what they call a Section 7 consultation. And so federal agencies such as the Army Corps then must consult with another federal agency if that agency is authorizing something that may affect listed endangered species there. And so we've got a number of endangered species along the Colorado River. In the air, we've got a bird called the yellow-billed cuckoo, as well as the more commonly referenced bald eagle. And then we also have 4 endangered fish here. And the Colorado River Fish Project was established back in the early 90s and include these 4 fish here with the pike minnow, the humpback chub, the sucker, and the bony tail chub there. So as part of this, as part of the permitting process, sometimes they'll figure out, or either the Army Corps or U.S. Fish and Wildlife will say, hey, we're okay with your project going in, but man, it sure appears that you're going to have some detrimental impacts on our endangered species. And so one example I have right next to Las Colonias that we built back in 1996 is our Old Mill Bridge, also known as our Orchard Mesa Bike Ped Bridge. And I'm showing there in that yellow circle, Orchard Mesa Middle School's over here to the left, just to kind of get you oriented. This is Eagle Rim Park here, and then of course Las Colonias Park over here. But when we built that in 1996, the Endangered Species Program was relatively new, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife came back and said, all right, we're okay with you dropping these 2 piers into the Colorado River, but we need some mitigation there. And so what we did instead is down west of Highway 50, down towards that Dos Rios development that I referenced at the start of my presentation, and right at the confluence of the Colorado River and the Gunnison River, right off the Riverside Parkway, is what we call a backwater for endangered species here. And the idea is, as the river flows higher in the spring during the high water seasons, this will back up with water through an opening down in here, and then the endangered species can come in there and lay their eggs and have their young in there. And then as the water recedes, then they get back out into the main stem after their young have had an opportunity to grow a little bit. And so we created that as part of mitigation for some of the permitting that we were, or for the permit that we were issued for that bridge there. And so as we move forward, this is just another shot of this right off the Riverfront Trail. We also put in, as part of that mitigation, some educational signage here. And so this is all about the humpback chub, and then, or actually the endangered fish there, and then some other recovery efforts that we have here, transforming that land from the 8,500 junk cars that were there into something that's a lot more useful for the environment as well as for our community. And so for the river park, just kind of backing up what the overall vision for that was. It was part of our original Las Colonias master plan. It was all about restoring the riparian area and improving habitat and ecology. We were recontouring that whole area to provide a natural braided river with water moving through it that also enhanced the endangered fish recovery program. It established 14 acres worth of riparian area, and with over 5.5 acres of water surface since 2013 have been added. It does not count as a diversion because it's still within the same 100-year floodplain. And again, it establishes, previous braids that were there, enhancing the health of the river corridor. But again, the primary benefit of all that was ecological, and the recreation component was secondary. Although with the popularity of it earlier this spring, you would have thought it was just the opposite of that. So when we went through our review with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Colorado Parks and Wildlife, they said the primary requirement was anytime there's less than 810 cubic feet per second in the river below, as measured there in Palisade, just below the Grand Valley Irrigation Company's diversion off of that, our braid should no longer be active. They also said, hey, there's some mitigation measures we want you to take to prevent the promulgation of non-native species of fish. If this is going to be habitat for endangered species, we don't want to have more predatory non-native species, coming through this area. They also asked that we don't. They limited our construction period, and in between April 1st and July 31st, they didn't want us out there working on this to avoid the spawning seasons, and then any equipment that was previously used in river or wetland water bodies needed to be disinfected. And then there's some requirements for us to maintain any sediment that's there on site, and then of course revegetation of any of that. And so this kind of shows what our adaptive management of flows into the river park. And so we actually, the hydraulic modeling that we did for the design of the river park, it isn't, there's a science to it. There's a lot of numbers and a lot of topography and a lot of modeling that goes into that, but it still isn't that accurate. And so what we found is, even though the river was less than 810 CFS, I think this was about 600 CFS on the day this picture was taken, we were still getting a little bit of water coming down our channel. And so we were adaptively managing those flows by putting the sandbags out here. And you can see we needed to do a little maintenance on this day with the sandbag getting overtopped. I think that night the flows had come back up over 1,000 CFS and had knocked that bag over. And so as it dropped back down the next day, we needed to go back out there and repair that. So that was one of the elements of adaptively managing the flows. And then the other part was making sure there wasn't any habitat within all of our boulders for non-native species. And so they call those interstitial spaces. And so what we did there was grout in between the boulders there. And grout is just a cement, a really flowy cement, high water content that you kind of press in and sit up in between there. And so that way, as the water levels come up, the smallmouth and largemouth basses that are more predatory to the endangered species wouldn't be able to plant their seeds and so forth, not plant them, but raise their young in those habitats there. So
Trent, I had a question. With the kind of compensation for how the hydraulic modeling wasn't 100%, and having to put the sandbags there to prevent the channel from pulling water off of the main stem when those flows got low. Is there well, I guess two things. One is like, what's magic about 810 CFS in the main stem? And then secondly, is there kind of a more long-term fix in the works for making it, maybe something more stable than sandbags for dealing with the, diverting when it's not supposed to challenge?
Yep, great question. So first part of that was the 810 CFS. And that is what the Endangered Species Program has secured in water rights for their program down through what we call the 15-mile reach, which is again from the diversion from GBIC's diversion up there in Palisade down to the confluence with the Gunnison. That is the 15-mile reach that you'll hear about here in the valley periodically. And so they've secured that amount of water rights. Now, some of those rights are more junior to GBIC's rights. And so GBIC will continue to take their full allotment of 1,000 to 1,100 cubic feet per second as long as they possibly can. And they definitely have not shown any concern for what's left in the river downstream. But nonetheless, anytime there's less than 810 cubic feet per second, the desire is to have all that water stay out there in the main stem for the Endangered Species Program. And so what we've done here is adaptively manage it with the sandbags. And yes, as that river, the river level comes up and back, we'll be able to get better survey information on exactly when that happens. And we're proposing probably raising the grade of this entrance in here or just downstream of this to the point that it only activates at 810 cubic feet per second. And that everything else stays out in the main stem. So we do want to do something else. This is relatively labor intensive for our Parks Department to get out here and maintain this every day. And to put all those out there takes about 3 guys, probably about probably right at about 2 hours, 2.5 hours by the time they go and get the sandbags and then have to walk them out there and hand place them. So definitely something we don't want to do long term. But for the short term, while we're figuring out essentially how to drive our new car, if you will, and make sure it conforms to the regulations of the permit those permit requirements, we're doing this kind of as an interim basis. But long term, we'll have more permanent facility out there. Anything else, Hannah?
Nope, I'm good.
Here's the interstitial spaces that we talked about with the grout in between the boulders down at one of our drop structures. And then, yeah, again, my recommendations, same ones that I discussed last time, for any regulatory partnerships there, meet with them early and often. I think I shared with you last time that I stood out at one of the locations just north of the Ped Bridge there with U.S. Fish and Wildlife personnel, even before any of this concept any of Las Colonias Park was going public. And I wanted their feedback first before all this went public and hit them cold. And so I wanted to make sure they were up to speed and that they were going to be at the table working with us as well. And so also a willingness to modify your designs to meet their goals and objectives. And so some of the ways we did that was making sure that the existing riverfront trail here was basically a line of demarcation in between the natural habitat, if you will, and then what they would allow is developed. And that was, they did not want us going south of that line whatsoever. And so we had originally planned on pushing much closer to the river with the river trail and some of our development. And they asked that we not do that and preserve that floodplain for all those other riparian uses. And so with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Awesome, that's great. Let's try having people, if you have questions, just go ahead and ask them with your voices. And if it turns out that we are talking over ourselves too much, then we can return to the mode of using chat. Anybody have any? This is a great opportunity having Trent here with us.
I have a question.
Great, go ahead.
So when it comes to trying to figure out correct regulations to follow with the companies and getting the permits, were there any times that you were at a standstill that you just couldn't figure out what to do?
I guess with the Army Corps in permitting of the boat ramp, and let me jump back here a few slides. We really didn't want to have to go to an what they call the individual permit. We wanted to stay in the nationwide realm, and so, but we weren't fitting within that the nationwide 36 at all, and so. We were kind of at a standstill for that. We didn't want to go all the way to an individual just due to the loss of time, and there's a very lengthy public review period as part of that. And sometimes you get various environmental groups that jump on just to jump on a permit and provide their use that as a opportunity to I don't know, be a little more challenging for some of us, I guess. So, but anyway, and so what Army Corps then came back after thinking through all the other permits that they had, and they just said, rather than using the boat ramp, which had some limitations to it, the boat ramp permit, why don't you jump down to the recreational facilities? Some of the other impasses that we had in regards to DOE was Department of Energy. And that had to do with what type of uses we wanted to have down here. There was a thought at one point that, hey, what if we had residences, up and above some of these, kind of have a live work space in some of the buildings down here. And so we were pushing hard to see if we could do that, or condominiums potentially, up here in this space. And maybe some live work units down here in the retail restaurant space and so forth. And they just came back and said, absolutely no way are we letting people live there. We'll let them work there. And they were even okay with the hotel going in, even though that's considered residential, just because the transitory nature of the clients there for hotels. I mean, they're in maybe a week at a time and then they're gone. But generally you don't have anybody staying for long periods of time. So they were okay with those uses, but they absolutely did not want residential for where someone would be living there either 24/7 or for a majority of the day, I guess. So those were really the only two big impasses, if you will. We really did want to sell these lots down in here, and we worked very closely with DOE and CDPHE on, okay, what does that look like? And it literally takes an act of Congress to get that that legislation changed. I think I'd mentioned the Uranium Mill Tailings Radiation Control Act of 1978. That is all federally legislated, and all those rules and guidelines were all part of that. And so literally it had taken an act of Congress to have those desires met. But yeah, great questions, Chloe.
How different?
Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. So how different are the interests at like the national level compared to like the local level? How do you balance out the interest of the people in Grand Junction?
Yeah, great question, Mario, because there's a lot that happens back east at the national level that's kind of forced down and on to us out here in the, if you will, the wild, wild west. And so some of those stresses have been more recently felt in the stormwater permitting realm, whereas and all those stormwater regulations were put together back east based on a lot of they have a lot of clear running water for the most part back east, and with all the development that was going on, there was lots of silt and sediment just totally contaminating those rivers back there. And so those regulations were passed nationwide as part of the Clean Water Act, or a subset of that, back in the early 90s. And first on what they call phase 1 cities, or all the big cities, and then phase 2 cities came in the early 2000s, and that's like Grand Junction. So those under a population of 100,000 are phase 2. And so all those regulations came down here. And so what people here locally get frustrated with when they're doing their developments, and they've got to put in their silt fencing, and they have to have water quality basins and all that to make sure no silt and sediment leaves their construction sites and gets into the Colorado River. And they're going, my construction site runoff is cleaner than the Colorado River is today, with all the silt and sediment that naturally occurs there. And so that's an example, Mario, of where those federal regulations are well-intentioned. And here on a smaller scale here, it's tough for us to try to enforce those regulations when, yeah, after a good rainstorm, the Colorado River is running basically like chocolate milk with a high degree of sediment. And actually, Colorado is Spanish for red. And it's called the Red River because of all the silt and sediment that is naturally occurring here. So anyway, yeah, great questions.
More? Anybody else have any other questions?
I just had one.
Go ahead.
So back when you were talking about the mitigation, especially for when the fish are spawning and stuff, you talked about how there's educational signs and stuff about like endangered fish and stuff that are spawning there. Are there like any preventative signs to keep people out of there? Just because I know since it's more of like, since the whole park is like basically a recreation park and stuff, are there ways that people will be able to keep out of there and stuff?
So the idea isn't so much to keep them out of there as it is to help bring them up to speed on what is happening there. This isn't just a lazy river like you might have in a rec center. I mean, this is an active river that's changing, daily, and is a key element to the recovery of not only the endangered species, but also a lot of other species rely on a riparian area. And so they really were looking more for this being kind of as a way to get more stewards of the river, if you will, more stewardship of the river, and by having people interact with the river, like through our river park, that hopefully at the end of the day that they'll be a little more cognizant of what is going on nationally, regionally, and statewide, and locally here through our 15-mile reach of the importance of rivers and so forth. And so that's really what we're hoping for long term. You know, yeah, as far as that being a braid for the endangered species to use, it absolutely is. Will they use it? We know we've had quite a few use it earlier this spring. But we also have a lot of non-natives that are out there that are present here in the waters. But yeah, as far as trying to keep people out of there, we don't see that that happening just yet, in the hopes that by having people recreate there, that they'll be better stewards of all things river related.
Speaking of educational signage, is there are there any plans to to put some plaques, maybe kind of like those that have more information kind of at the entrance to the river park that explain why the flows have to be limited to the lazy river when the river gets low, to help people understand that?
So we did have signage out there, but they were just 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper that were on what we call T-posts, so those green fence posts. And we did have those out there just saying, hey, flows below 810 CFS, all flows need to stay in the river, in the main stem, or something along those lines. And so we did that kind of mitigate, or that kind of education. But yes, there's a whole other level of education that we want to be able to provide for folks down there, and probably take signs similar to these, update them with language that will work with Colorado Parks and Wildlife and U.S. Fish and Wildlife on replicating those up there as well. So as people are coming along, or while they're watching their kids, float down, there's something for them to read, and maybe gain a little deeper appreciation for what all's happening there, not only in that channel, but the overall riparian system here through town.
Other folks have questions?
I was wondering if there were any really interesting or particularly important stakeholders that you had to work with.
Each group, each entity that we were working with, whether it be Colorado Parks and Wildlife or Army Corps, DOE, CDPHE, any of those, they all are coming from their particular interests, and so U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they are all about endangered species. Well, all species, but in particular in this area, endangered species. And so they are just, it is just so cool to see people that passionate about what they do, and even DOE, Department of Energy, and they are in the role here of just kind of button up and close off some of these old processing sites, and yet they are so passionate about what they do. And so from an interesting standpoint, it was great getting into that a little deeper depth of knowledge, or a lot deeper depth of knowledge in regards to our endangered fish program. There's a gentleman at U.S. Fish and Wildlife that is just top notch, by the name of Dale Riken. And he is really great guy to work with, very pragmatic, in working with us, but yeah, his understanding of fish and so forth were very good. As far as others that we worked with as part of the project, and I know Sarah Schrader's on here as well, but her husband Thad is an awesome visionary, and he's got such a great vision of what could happen down here along the riverfront. And honestly, with, even though we had done a lot of master planning, it was that vision that kind of spurred some other opportunities to bring in some other local funds that normally wouldn't have been available for us to even contemplate, let alone build everything that's been built down here since then. So, but he had a lot of ideas that came to the table that and constantly changing visions and, or, hey, what about this? What about that? And so that always kept me on my toes. You know, we now have a lake that's the shape of a butterfly. And if you'd have told me 5 years ago I'd be designing a lake in the shape of a butterfly, I'd have said, nah, that's not happening. And but anyway, but there it is, immortalized in concrete, and it's just an absolutely beautiful facility that people are enjoying daily. So so yeah, those were some of the different groups that were rather interesting. On other projects, you know, where there are underlying property owners, such as like in our well, many of our other projects, you always come across, you know, 3 or 4 that kind of stick in the back of your mind as being either a little more challenging or just really interesting to work with based on where their passions are coming from. That answer your question, Drew?
Yeah, totally. Thanks.
Any others? I have a few in my back pocket in case other people don't have them, but I'd like to hear what interests you guys. One thing I'm interested in, Trent, is how the process of developing a site like this compares in terms of both the complications and the rewards compared to, like, say, a commercial development in a greenfield site.
So, you know, we've definitely evolved, speaking of species, we've evolved as a species, as humans, you know, to realize that the way we were treating our river, you know, over the past wasn't quite right. And so I mean, and with the mill tailings and all that, and we finally figured that out in the late 80s that, hey, we really need to haul all these tailings out of here. This isn't good for the river. It's not good for the riparian area. It's not good for a growing community. And so for that to, you know, to transition, you know, out, to move all the tailings out, then it's just left vacant, you know, for 20 years. Not really a community asset at all, other than just wide open dirt. You know, I know we had the river trail going through there. But now to put something in like this that is absolutely going to be a jewel for our community for many generations to come, and it's absolutely a thrill to be a part of that. As opposed to, you know, right next to this is the Riverside Parkway, and I was part of that back in 2003 through 2008, and that's been well loved and a great amenity, and awesome to see that being used, you know, even to this date, you know, every day. But this has got a whole other level of community benefit here, and being a river rafter, river lover myself, I love seeing that many more people becoming engaged with the river and helping activate that space.
But as far as, so it's pretty satisfying to be able to be a part of putting something like this together. But I mean, I mean, I'm sure you have to deal with regulatory agencies, and, you know, yourself act as on behalf of the city when a developer comes in to want to put, you know, a shopping center or a, you know, housing development somewhere else that's less complicated. Can you compare like the length of the process of just getting all the permits together to do this project versus a kind of a, you know, maybe similar scale but less complicated site?
Right. So yeah, definitely the DOE past usage, you know, of, I mean, for the uranium program down here, definitely had a whole other level of complexities there. And then they call that brownfield development, something that's already been developed once. Maybe some sins were committed there. Such as like on the, if anyone's familiar with the Grand Valley Transit's transfer facility down here off of 5th Street and South Avenue. That used to be an old steam plant for Xcel Energy, or the Public Service of Colorado is what the prior name of it was. And there were all sorts of PCBs and all that left in the soil there. And so even though we got the land for like 20,000 bucks, yeah, it cost us another $1 million to clean it up before you could even get any other beneficial use going in over the top of that. So yeah, the complexities with having to work with Colorado Department of Health and Environment and sometimes other, and the EPA on a lot of those cleanups, yeah, extremely more time consuming. There's a lot more risk involved in that when you're trying to lay out a schedule for a particular project, and definitely can be fairly problematic as compared to greenfield development, which is you're working with your local planning office here, either with the city or Mesa County, and much easier to go that route than it is with brownfields. But the brownfield stuff, like for here, if you're going to be up against the river, there just aren't that many spots that are up against the river with these kind of views and amenities and so forth. And if you're going to be right downtown, if that's where you want to be, sometimes it's going to be a little more expensive, a little more time consuming to put your buildings there as opposed to on a green field out north of town.
Then the community rewards are much bigger also.
They are. Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions?